Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to Reddit Aliens. I'm John, and as always, thank you so much for being here. A rare part 2 to a follow-up? Let's do it. Serious, police officers of Reddit. What was the most intense call you've ever been on, and how did you handle the aftermath? Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. For me, it was my first, and to this date, my only shooting, where I was actually present and a few feet away from the person who let a few shots off. We were just responding to a call for backup for crowd control when someone was almost stabbed to death. A little more crowd control and a scuffle breaks out, so we go to stop that and in our minds prevent another stabbing when someone lets off a few shots. I didn't see the gun, but most cops will know gunshots when they hear them. A crowd started running away, and I saw a kid laying on the ground covered in blood. Me and a few others went on a chase for a few blocks, but we eventually lost the alleged shooter. Turns out, the bloodied kid was covered in the blood of his friend, who was stabbed earlier. No one ended up getting hit. All in all, from the moment the shots were fired to the moment we called off the chase, it was no more than 10 minutes, but it felt like an eternity. The thing I had trouble with, and still do to some extent, was that once the dust all settled from that, I had to go back to doing the routine police stuff, which, on that night, was filling out an accident report like nothing even happened. Meanwhile, I just lived through the most traumatic event of my life. When I was going home that night, I just couldn't stop thinking about how after what I had just went through, I had now to go back to just being a regular person in society. Like I wasn't just a few feet away from having a few rounds lodged inside of me. I imagine for more veteran cops and the guys with a military background, what I went through would probably not even be an afterthought, but I'm a guy who lived a life with very little danger or conflict up until I became a cop. It's been a great bonding experience for my partner and I overall. It's been very humbling. We talk about that night almost daily, and that's been very helpful for getting over the tiny bit of PTSD that I had with it. I've had trouble sleeping at times since, and I had some recurring dreams about it for weeks immediately after. Mind you, I never saw the gun. It was a smaller gun, probably like a .22 caliber, and I didn't return fire, nor did any of the dozen or so cops on scene. If something like that had the impact it did on me, imagine what guys who've actually been in more serious incidents must be dealing with. Ironically, very little will get my adrenaline pumping anymore, and as bad as it sounds, I feel like at times I'm wishing something like that will go off again so I can get that adrenaline rush that I've only experienced in this one incident. You know, I'm sure it's easy to second guess yourself after going through something traumatic to you, and there may be someone that has gone through something even more traumatic. Maybe they just handle it differently. So it's almost like, I know this is stupid new words, like trauma shaming. If it affects you, it affects you. So don't worry about anybody else's experience. So everybody goes through it. I had a guy that slit his own throat after he got rejected by the girl he liked after she went to bed. There was so much blood everywhere, it's like he made a point to visit every single room multiple times as in last F you to her. Based on the clotting of the blood, it appeared that he slowly cut his neck over like an 8-hour period. I had an elderly lady jump off a bridge and left her 26-year-old autistic daughter at home with no one to care for her. That was the most difficult death notification I've done. It might be different for different people, but for me, there can't really be one terrible thing. There's just a threshold between those things that are terrible and those things that wake you up at night crying. Trying to rank them isn't really even possible. It's the realm of madness, and sane men can't walk there. There was a time a friend of a friend locked himself in his room in college, and we all went to check on him. We didn't get a response, and I was the only one skinny enough to get in over the wall through the ceiling. I dropped down half a foot from him to find him dead with milky eyes. Then there was the guy I found in the gutter after he got his legs and arms beaten in with a sledgehammer. I later found out what he did to make many people that angry. Then there was the car accident where I had to keep that kid with traumatic head injury awake until the ambulance got there. And there was the time some drunk driver hit someone walking on a back road, breaking his neck. I pulled up just in time to hear the man on the ground pleading with the driver not to move him. I was screaming at him to stop as well, but didn't get there in time. The driver lifted up the man's head, but his shoulders stayed on the ground. He let go and dropped him when he realized what he'd just done. I was giving CPR and breathing, but couldn't save him. He died before paramedics arrived. Then there's the time the two brothers drove halfway under the side of a head-on double-wide, being trucked to site, both at highway speeds. There really wasn't much blood in the car, considering the driver was torn in half and everything above the waist was thrown into the culvert on the side of the road. The passenger was untouched. The police arrived. The paramedics had to sedate the other brother to prevent him from going into shock. There are more, of course. The untreated diabetic, the dead mother, the dog, and the deer, more. I'm one of those people that runs towards the screaming, so it's normal that there would be, I suppose. A suspect had held his girlfriend and her child hostage in their mobile home for quite a while. He fled during the lengthy time it took us to locate the residences. Lots of the lower-end trailer parks in my area are labeled with a letter-number combo instead of their actual address. He's reported to be in the wooded area by the trailer park, which was quite large. We establish a search pattern and have canines running tracks on the guy. We finally find him deep in the woods, where he's sitting against a tree with a shotgun pointed up under his chin. Suicidal people who are holding themselves hostage are pretty common, and usually have a positive outcome, as long as they are the only endangering themselves. Then, we don't have to use force against them. We let the negotiator talk to them as long as they want, provided the suspect doesn't pose a threat to anyone else. In this case, he talked almost all day. Unfortunately, due to our position in the woods, we were unable to access any of the usual equipment we use on long operations. There's an entire group of support personnel that operate behind the scenes. This became a problem, since we were losing light, and the terrain prevented us from safely surrounding him without putting each other in potential crossfire. In situations like this, we use an L-shaped formation to keep from shooting each other. The downside is that it gives the suspect a wide path of escape. We let the negotiator talk with the suspect until we were almost totally in the dark, and it became apparent he was not going to surrender. Since we could not allow an unstable subject to possibly flee back into the trailer park with a weapon, Command decided that we must physically intervene. Those of us near the apex of the formation were only about 10 to 15 feet away from the suspect, since it was getting harder and harder to see him, and since he had not pointed the weapon at anyone but himself since he hit the woods. The plan, which has worked several times before and after, was to offer the suspect a pack of cigarettes, then toss a flashbang nearby. The team knows what's up, so as soon as the bang is tossed, we're already moving on the suspect. Humans have a defensive reflex when startled, where they will usually drop whatever they're holding and slightly extend their arms in front of their faces. This guy didn't react as expected and blew his head off immediately after the bang fired. We handled it the same way we handle every other horrific thing we see. Keep our game faces on while we're on scene, second guess the hell out of ourselves, then get drunk with a teammate and rehash the call out until we feel a little bit better. It's not the best way to deal, but there it is. 2 things. I once responded to a guy that was hit by a train. Apparently he was a homeless man and went onto the subway tracks to get a cigarette and didn't make it back before the train came to the station. Dude was cut in 2 halves. His upper half was on the platform and his lower half was on the tracks. For some reason, seeing his spinal cord was what bothered me the most. The second most intense thing was, F it, I don't want to talk about it. Not a police officer, but my brother is, and he's told me crazy shit. He's a very good cop, and a lot of it is that he's empathetic and understands mental illness and stress and how to talk to people, former social worker therapist. He's also got that morbid cop humor and knows exactly when to deploy it. And I think all of those factors are how he copes. It's easy for him to talk about it with his coworkers and sometimes with family, and he has a lot of understanding about how to cope with trauma. The 2 stories that have always stuck out for me One was a guy who was attempting suicide by jumping off of a building. He'd climbed about 75% of the way up. My brother doesn't bat an eyelash, climbs up, and the only thing he can think of to say is to the guy is, "Oh, come on, dude. You could have at least bothered to go all the way to the roof. From here, you'll probably just break your legs." The guy looked over, stared at him for a minute, and then just cracked up laughing, climbed back down a little while after. The second was literally his first day on the job working for the crisis squad, meaning he was unarmed and sent specifically into situations that involved very sensitive topics like the mentally ill, child abuse, etc. The call was for a guy who was threatening to kill his neighbors because he was off his meds and believed he could hear them talking about him through the walls. My brother goes in, completely unarmed, and the guy immediately shuts the door and locks it. Then he tells my brother, "I have a gun." My brother convinces him to hand it over, and then keeps talking to the guy, who reveals he has 9 more guns stashed around the row house. He spent something like 4 hours with this guy, just calmly talking him through the location of every single firearm in the house. Literally walked out the front door with this gigantic bag of guns and flipped the bird at everyone else who was on scene.